The last several weeks we have been reading together through the Exodus, crossing the Red Sea, coming into the wilderness, crying out to God for manna and for water and for fear. Last week, Moses went up the mountain and received there the 10 Commandments. We've now skipped over 12 chapters because for 40 days Moses was up on the mountain. For 40 days, in addition to the 10 Commandments, God described for Moses the building of the tabernacle, all the appointments of the priests, all the things that they were to do in worship. Then comes this in a reading from chapter 32, the book of Exodus. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around the mountain and came to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make for us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it into a mold, cast an image of a calf, and they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices for well-being. And the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up in revelation. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume all of them. Of you I will make a great nation." Moses implored the Lord and said to God, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was in evil and with an evil intent that you brought them out to kill them in the mountains of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath. Change your mind. Do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply their descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind. Changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on this people. And Moses turned and went down from the mountain, carrying the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hands. Tablets that were written on both sides, written on front and on the back, tablets that were the work of God. And the writing was the writing of God, engraved upon the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people as they shouted, Joshua said to Moses, "There's a noise of war in the camp." But he said, "It's not the sound made by victors or the sound made by losers. It's the sound of revelers that I hear." As soon as Moses came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets from his hands and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made, burned it with fire, ground it to a powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink. Turning to the New Testament, we read there in the Gospel according to Matthew at the 22nd chapter. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying to them, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who'd been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying to them, "Tell those who have been invited, 'Look, I've prepared my dinner. My ox and my fat calves have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it, and they went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the slaves, maltreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city, then said to his slaves, 'But the wedding is ready. Those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets. Invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' The slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. When the king came in to see the guests, he noticed that one there was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?' He was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, 'Bind this one hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" We begin this morning by challenging our most basic assumptions that lead to anxiety. Humanity has existed for 1,000,000 years. In this time, we have progressed through manifest destiny to believe that we have improved and improved and improved until the world is complete and everything is good. We have survived the 20th century. We've survived wars. We've survived famines. We've survived revolutions. We survived 9/11. We survived the stock market crash. We survived the housing boom crash. Week by week, we've turned on Antiques Roadshow and realized that we've survived even though all our stuff has become worthless. We've survived. And we begin to believe, as Isaiah described in Isaiah 40, "All flesh is grass. Grass withers, the flower fades." But the grace of God, the grace undercuts all the judgment, all the sin, all our feelings of destruction and decay and entropy, that the world is collapsing. There is still God's word. There is still grace that appears. The people of Israel had come through incredible ordeals, great trauma. They had been slaves who suddenly were set free and brought through an ocean to the other side and survived one ordeal after another. And then Moses, who had physically led them through the wilderness, went up the mountain, and on the top of the mountain there were clouds that descended, and thunder and lightning and trumpet blasts and earthquakes, and the people were afraid. And Moses stayed up there for 40 days and 40 nights while they were in the wilderness. Do you remember another story about being in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights? That was Jesus' temptation. So also this is the nation of Israel's temptation. They've been led into the wilderness and are questioning whether they can still be faithful to God, even when left alone. And the first thing the people do is to fail. I would invite us to unpack these passages today because on first blush, these are terrible, awful passages. These are brutal. I didn't want to read these passages this morning. They're so gruesome. And yet, if we unpack them, we come to realize that there are other stories underneath these that are powerful for us in our faith. The first is that while Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, he received from God the 10 Commandments. He received all the glory and beauty that was to be the nation before God. And we've referred to this passage as the golden calf because we focus on the sin. We focus on the judgment. We focus on the wrongs that we've done, that Israel did, and for this, we know that we're all condemned. But God didn't leave us there. Instead, in this passage, Moses speaks up for the people. When I was in seminary, on the very first day, James Forbes was the professor who described that your role as believers, our role as baptized believers, is not only to believe, not only to pray for our needs and for the needs of all the world, but also, just like Moses, our responsibility is to challenge God. Our responsibility is to stand up to God when we do not feel as though life is fair and to call God out and defend it. Free will is not only doing your own thing, which leads to sin. Free will is also demanding of God faith, demanding of God grace, unmerited, unwarranted, undeserved, but God is still God, and we are still God's people, and so God provides for us. One of my favorite windows in this sanctuary is the one at the center as you go out into the world. That's one of the most powerful windows because it's the last thing you see as you go out into the world. And there at the center of it is a script letter C with a script letter A superimposed over the top of it and the and % sign as a way of saying, yes, God has a plan. Calvinism was about predestination. As human beings, we all sin. If given the choice, we're going to choose for ourselves, we're going to be afraid, we're going to do wrong. But there's also free will. Arminianism, the A in that symbol, was a way of saying each of us have a freedom of choice. Each of us have a responsibility to choose for ourselves what we will do. And the ampersand sign was a way of saying, yes, there is a plan from God, but we each also have a freedom of will to choose. And as you choose, you reveal a different part of God's plan than had ever been revealed before. There is a new future, a new possibility because of what you demand of God. Too often, we think that this is all there is, and we limit ourselves. God's vision for us is limitless. I would call us to change the title of this passage. Instead of being about the golden calf, what this is really about is our anxiety shaming God. Before Moses even came down from the mountain, before the people ever received the 10 Commandments, they'd already broken the first by declaring that they wanted to worship other gods. And they had directed Aaron to break the second by making an idol for them to worship. But as we described last week, the 10 Commandments are not about laws because laws get broken. The 10 Commandments were about our relationship with God, our trust from God, that through Moses, through Israel, all the world would come into relationship in the love of God. So what happens in the breaking of these two is not simply sin, is not simply evil, is not simply the breaking of laws, but a shame of God, to where God doesn't want to deal with his people anymore. Let's commit Sodom and Gomorrah all over again and destroy them and have a new Genesis. Just as God began with Noah and God began with Abraham, God could begin again with Moses and make of him a great nation. That worked the other two times. Why not try it yet again? And Moses stands up and says, no. And the most amazing part of it is God changed God's mind. We tend to think of God as being all-knowing, but God can change God's mind. God can listen and have compassion and act in grace. We tend to believe that the New Testament is all about grace and forgiveness, and the Old Testament judge. But the reality is that there in the very beginning, even at the gift of the Ten Commandments, God is already offering grace and forgiveness and compassion. And a wonderful tidbit I would hope that you'll remember is that the golden calf and the tablets of stone, each were very fragile. Each were easily broken. But God's relationship, that's flexible. That's adaptive. God continues to reach out to us even as we have done wrong. God forgives. It's not a limited universe. Instead, God continues to create, continues to enter in and redeem, continues to offer possibilities. So often, we shame one another, we shame God, we shame ourselves, instead of witnessing the grace, lifting up for each other the possibilities that God has provided for us in our midst that otherwise we would not see. Jesus shared this parable, which I believe was actually 3 different parables that Matthew put together. It begins very similar to the one last week. Last week, as a day of judgment, we described that there was a landowner who planted a garden, and it was rich and prosperous, and he had workers there who tended the garden. But when the judgment day came, the day of harvest, they decided to keep it all for themselves and to kill the messengers and to kill the son, for which God decided to destroy that people. Here we have a wedding feast, and the people decide to ignore God and to ignore his messengers and to kill the messengers, and God elects to kill them. It is Sodom and Gomorrah. It is predestination. You do wrong and you get punished. However, God doesn't leave them there. Instead, there is a second parable that comes into this. I love that Matthew framed this in a wedding feast. Because as your pastor, I've done as many as 30 weddings a year for the last 33 years. That's a lot of weddings. And in this community has shocked me. Because over and over again at these weddings, the family have hired police officers to be here. Because the guests couldn't all get along with each other. The family were afraid of other family members and needed to have the police here just in case. Nothing has ever come out of any of these, but we've been afraid. That is the wedding feast. There's a reason why Matthew chose a wedding feast. It's not just about making up the guest list. It's how we relate to each other. In the second part of this parable, the second parable that Matthew combined in, God reaches out again. Even though the first ones did wrong, even though they deserved to be punished and condemned, God sent out messengers to call them in, to call all in. Last summer, something amazing happened. There was a couple who were planning to get married, and at the last minute they decided it was wrong. They weren't able to marry. But they'd already put the deposit down on the reception. They'd already put the deposit down on the food. They'd already put the deposit down on the clothing. They couldn't get those deposits back. And so they sent out word to the veterans' home and all the shelters and brought them in. And each one was given a tuxedo and a fine dress to come and celebrate at this banquet. It's a living out of this parable. When they couldn't go ahead with the wedding feast the way in which they planned, they invited the homeless. They invited the wounded to come and to receive. I think there's an updating that we need to do with this parable. How many of you know lepers? How many of you, this one's good. How many of you know prostitutes? Good. How many of you know Pharisees? So this parable doesn't seem to fit with us. Instead, for those who get called in for the wedding, Let us think about those who are depressed, those who are unemployed, those who feel broken, those who feel as though they cannot be forgiven and cannot forgive themselves. These are the ones who are invited in. It is not for us who are already baptized and confirmed and elders and deacons in the church. It is for those who feel broken, to be welcomed in, to have a place at the table. That is Calvin's predestination. That yes, we sin, we choose our own way, but God continues to offer grace and possibility, and to welcome in all who are broken. Too often, I think we have a hard time forgiving ourselves, harder even than God has of forgiving us. But there's a third part to this parable, I think an original third parable, that only occurs here in Matthew. And that is that the father of the bridegroom comes in and sees there one out of the whole body that are gathered who didn't put on a wedding garment. Is this about clothes? No, I think this is the most relevant and hardest part of all the scriptures, because all of us deal with multitasking. We believe we can do 6 different things at the same time, and we get caught because we can't do it all. I would love to rename this passage, instead of being about the wedding feast, to being about those who have it all and really have nothing. I agonize at how many times I've been invited to go to funerals at other churches, and I want to honor that person and their family by being a pastor in the community, going to these events. But I have another event in 2 hours, and the funeral goes long. And I'm sitting in the middle of the funeral watching my watch. That's not putting on the wedding garment. Being distracted by so many things. Not being able to be present in the moment to enjoy the glory of what this is. But instead, to try to do so many different things that we can't accomplish anything. Too often, we shame God. Too often, we turn for our own desires. But God continues to reach out to us, to offer grace to us, to offer possibility. John Calvin, who wrote out the theology for the Presbyterian Church, described what is often referred to as double predestination. What that refers to is that, yes, following freedom of will, we are predestined to go to hell. We will choose wrong. But God offers grace and offers possibility. But if we choose to come in without a wedding garment, if we choose to receive the grace without being willing to be forgiven or forgiving others, we make it a cheap grace. We deny God the possibility to get through to us. That is the double part of predestination, and we condemn ourselves. Brothers and sisters, forgive yourself. Forgive your brothers and sisters. Know that you are forgiven by God because God loves you. It's as simple as that. No matter how much we've shamed one another, no matter how much we've hated, God loves you and wants the very best.